Hey there, my name is Jason Bradley. You may recognize my voice from such places as the Community Solutions Podcast, which, by the way, you're listening to now. Before we begin, can I bend your ear for just a moment? We want to bring you the very best in quality and information each week. You can help us achieve that level of greatness. If you sell something, want to announce something, or try to convince others to vote for you, consider advertising on the Community Solutions Podcast. You can email us at commsolutionsmn@gmail.com, and we'd love to help you tell everyone about what you do. Once again, that's commsolutionsmn@gmail.com. commsolutionsmn@gmail.com. Let us be your solution to increased sales. We thank you ahead of time for your consideration. Okay, enough yammering. On with the show. Somehow I'm still here to explain that the darkest hour never comes in the night. You can sleep with a gun when you're going to wake up and fight. This is the Community Solutions Podcast, and your host, Jason Bradley, right here. We're just kind of kicking back and having some fun. My partner, my what do we want to call you? What
co-pilot.
Co-pilot, whatever. Andrew Richter, he's here. He's just kind of vegging out. We're gonna take it easy. So you're getting married in about less than 24 hours.
That's right.
So by the time you all hear this, he'll be on his honeymoon, and you're just. We wanted to have fun. We didn't want to bring him down before tomorrow. We wanted to have a show that was a little more lighthearted and where we could kind of just draw on all of our knowledge and bring you something that is going to be informative but yet not too heavy.
I like that description.
Okay. Well, before we get into that, I just want to say, Minneapolis, what? You go into the Friday before the 4th of July holiday at 9:35 in the morning. What kind of coward does this, where you have no public input, or at least people that have regular jobs or on vacation with their families, they don't get to have input, but you passed it anyways. $15 minimum wage, great. You guys are swell. You're cruising along.
I'd hate to be a business who just signed a 5-year lease in Minneapolis.
Oh my word! I'd be.
I'll tell you what. One of the things I think that we've seen, and we've seen this a little bit. We've seen it at the grocery store where self-checkout and stuff, and I think eventually that stuff is going to come in 40 years or 50 years.
Right.
That's what it'll be here in 5 years.
Ugh.
We just sped it up.
Yeah. Look for a mass exodus of businesses to go into Bloomington, to go into Plymouth.
If they're not stupid enough to follow Minneapolis,
right?
Let's not make the assumption that Robbinsdale or a city like that's not looking at the same thing.
I'd be headed to Carver County. I'd be headed to
western Minnesota. I'd be headed to Anoka County.
Good news, Greater Minnesota. Jobs are coming your way.
Yeah, no kidding.
Oh my word!
You gonna tip a waiter making $15 an hour? I don't know.
My word!
Give him a tip. Get a new job.
All right. We're not going to dwell on that. We're not going to go down that path because that's just darkness. We're gonna talk about something lighter today. Well, hopefully. We'll see. We may get our blood boiling a little bit. We're going to talk about...
Sure I will.
We're going to talk about the overreach of the executive branch. And you just wait. We're going to tie this back into local politics. You're going to be amazed. Because, after all, we are Community Solutions. So it's up to us to make this work. To give you something that not only gives you a greater understanding of what's going on at a federal or state level, but then to tie that back into how it works at the local level. So stick with us. Don't check out.
Yeah, you're going to like the historical analysis. What we're going to give you, you're not going to get anywhere else.
Exactly.
I'm not going to turn on the History Channel and hear it said how we say it. No way.
No way.
Right.
Nope.
They're owned by GE.
So all of you that have friends and family that watch the History Channel, all that stuff, you might want to forward this.
If there was any history on there, it would be good.
Right.
Like watching
Ancient Aliens with
Alaska Ice
Crazy
Road
guy,
Truckers or whatever they show on there. There was a time when they showed the Real West and they showed Civil War Journal. I can still watch those on YouTube. Kenny Rogers used to narrate the shows about the Old West. That was when the History Channel was great. Now I don't know what the hell it is. It's ETV now.
Yeah.
It's a sad thing.
It is a sad thing. All right. Well, let's back way up. There has always been kind of a fight for strong government. I mean, you can go back to Hamilton and make the case that there were factions of our government that wanted the really heavy-handed governing.
Or they wanted the federal government to be one thing and the states to be something. I think. Let me just address that real quick. Yeah. I think the Articles of Confederation were such chaos. Yeah. I think it lent itself to overreaching.
I think
on the one
so too.
hand, I mean, I wouldn't mind Alexander Hamilton in charge today.
No,
but for his time, he was a nationalist.
Yeah,
which was controversial.
Right
then, what we would call a federalist.
Right
now.
I still think that the whole national bank idea was bad, but other than that, leaving that aside, I think I would be happy with an Alexander Hamilton type today over, what we have. But through that first phase of America, I mean, there wasn't too much of that. I mean, yeah, you had in the Civil War. Obviously, if we're fast forwarding a bit, but looking back, I mean, you had guys like George Washington that chose without anything in the Constitution to relinquish his power after 2 terms, who didn't want to be called king, who all of this. You had Thomas Jefferson, champion of liberty. You had, all these great people early on. Again, I know in our last show we talked about Jackson and things like that, and there's some issues, but overall, I think if you weighed the balances, that it would be more towards liberty than against in the first phase of American history. And then when you get to the Civil War, Lincoln, and I'm still going to say that he was a great president, he had to kind of clamp down, but he relinquished his power after the war.
And let me give you a good example on Lincoln. The controversy always comes with the what were called the Copperheads,
right?
The anti-war people, Clement Vallandigham, and the people like that. Lincoln had a great quote about it, and I wish I could remember it. But he said something about, okay, if a soldier deserts, they deserve to die. What do I do with the person who encourages them to desert, tells them to desert, incentivizes them to desert? Why does that person get up? Why is that freedom of speech? Mm-hmm. It's an interesting way to look at it. That you're in the army, you don't get a choice to go desert.
Right.
But if you're, speaking about the cruel, evil, inhumane war, then that's protected by freedom of speech. And I think President Lincoln wrestled with that a lot. I think some of his generals acted on their own. Mm-hmm. People like Burnside and some people like that, and John Fremont, who were not as tactful as President Lincoln was. And, I'm one that considers the Civil War a crisis. If that's not a crisis, I don't know what calls for that. At the same time, it was controversial, and it's still... But you're right, it ended... It wasn't an excuse to grow government permanently. I always talk about, when I talk about the Civil War, our first income tax.
Yes.
Was in the Civil War. It was slightly progressive in nature. Mm-hmm. And guess what? When the war was over...
It went away.
It went away.
Yep.
And everybody from all factions agreed.
Yep.
And now today we have a tax to build a stadium, and that stadium's paid for. The government finds something else to spend it on. I mean, it was just you're right. It was a different mindset of the role of government and self-determination.
Absolutely. And I don't know. It's not for me to judge, I guess, that, what Lincoln did to circumvent some liberties was good or bad, or necessary or not at the time. It was good that he relinquished that power at the end of the war. I think that it would be disingenuous to say otherwise.
Right, and you look at the presidents after him, they didn't try to use an executive order to revive this or that.
Right.
So, yeah, you're right. They all came from the same mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you see that whether it's Cleveland or any of those guys. I mean, we were discussing that some of them are seen as weak presidents, but they were just really following the Constitution.
Yeah,
and they just kind of...
I think if you go through and study some of those presidents, I don't think you can call President Grant a weak guy. Mm-mm. He didn't have the best judgment.
No, he did not.
But he was not a weak-willed person. I think President Hayes was a subject of his own election, or non-election.
Yeah.
President Garfield really didn't get a chance to govern, and if you look at somebody like Benjamin Harrison, for example, there were a lot of things done under his presidency. Mm-hmm. Now, some of them weren't all the best, whether that was, buying silver, whether that was, the McKinley tariff, or whatever. But I don't think... And they all are kind of forgotten. If you look between Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, I wonder how many presidents your average American could name. It's about 8 of them. And I think that, I think you'd be hard-pressed to get people to remember those names. And I think it's unfortunate.
I think it is, too. And I think that for the story we're trying to tell... Yeah, it goes back to the Civil War because that's where a lot of the seeds were planted for what happens next.
For progressivism.
Yeah. But, I mean, really, when you get to the Spanish-American War and President McKinley on, I mean, that's when I think we start to see a change in the power of the executive.
And I think it's 2 things. I think it was foreign policy was one.
Yes.
I think the gold standard and the silver became another.
Right.
Because that's where you first, with the populace, that's where you first identified classes of people. Industrialization had taken over the eastern part of the Northeast. The South and the West really hadn't changed much, and regionalism came back again. And it was very different economic times. And the gold-silver debate is a great example of, amazingly, we didn't have a Federal Reserve.
No.
And the country didn't die. But that's, if you look at the rise of somebody like William Jennings Bryan or somebody like that, again, you talk about the seeds. I mean, in the 1890s are really, and there was economically depressed time. Mm-hmm. President Cleveland's second term was just riddled with that.
And a lot of people don't know that because it was overshadowed by the Great Depression.
Yeah, and you had just as bad of times then, and they lingered on into President McKinley's term as we had. It was much, you could argue, it was much longer and much more severe,
right,
than what happened in the 1930s. So I think you had that combined with America's changing role in the world, which would erode completely with World War I and World War II.
Yes.
It would change forever. And you mentioned changing the executive branch. There's no question foreign policy is where it's become the most, I don't want to say egregious, but where the power has shifted from the balance of power that we're supposed to have, the checks and balances that our Constitution requires.
Right. And so for those of you who maybe don't know a ton about the Spanish-American War, and it's something that I don't think is really studied a whole lot because the World Wars, the Civil War, takes so much of of our attention, as we go through school. I mean, there are other wars that we just don't know a lot about, and whether that was fighting the Barbary pirates way back in
Jefferson's time,
during Jefferson's time, or whether
Mexican War,
the Mexican
War, never talked about either. I'll tell you what, the Revolutionary War is not talked about.
Which is amazing.
It boggles my mind that you mentioned the Battle of Trenton, or you mentioned Washington on the Delaware. Huh? What did he do?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no conception of the Revolutionary War or the French and Indian War, which is before that.
Right.
And you're right. The Spanish-American War is talked about very little. But I'm going to tell you something. It shaped our foreign policy, I think, going into the 20th century way more than people have recognized.
Oh, absolutely.
Because that's a war we didn't have to fight.
No, we wanted Spain out of Cuba.
Yeah. Right. And the media played a role in that war.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
Even back then.
True. I mean, you didn't have options in the media. You had print media, and that was the yellow press.
Yeah.
Is what they were called. And it was our first war. You mentioned getting Spain out of Cuba. It was our first war of intervention. It was our first war of, McKinley is often compared to George W.
Yes.
And I think I think his administration is comparable in that you had people in the administration, not necessarily McKinley himself or Bush himself,
right,
looking for, I hate to use the word, an excuse to do something for. I mean, a Teddy Roosevelt would kind of be like a Richard Pearl or a Paul Wolfowitz to George W. Somebody like Roosevelt or Admiral Dewey, who was technically not in the administration, but John Hay, who later served under Roosevelt too. I mean, we're kind of rabble rousers. They had this. They thought big and they didn't care about the details.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and we look at America's foreign policy and how at that time, I don't want to say we were completely isolationist, because we weren't completely isolationist, but I think that we did mind our business a whole lot more, than after the Spanish-American War. Because, look at all the places that landed us in and where we're still not out of. How long were we entangled in the Philippines?
Oh, well, until after World War II.
Yeah, and what about how long, we still have Puerto Rico?
Yeah, absolutely. And even Cuba, we still have military bases there.
We do.
Even though they're not a friendly country.
No.
We've never left there either.
No, and, we're talking the 1890s, and we're still there from that war. So,
and you could argue some of the things we did to Cuba were not self-determination either. I mean, we imposed things in their constitution afterward that were questionable. I can't remember what those were exactly, but we sent troops back in there several times. I mean, we didn't exactly turn over one of the things that was attached to the war funding was that we were not going to make Cuba a state. We were not going to do that.
Right.
Unfortunately, that just meant we went to Puerto Rico instead. And we fought in the Philippines because they were Spanish possessions. I mean, Spain was colonizing them, then we came and colonized them.
Right.
I mean, I realize we're the good guys, but ultimately, it was, like you said, it was our first war of intervention, and from that point on, there was no turning back. We were an empire now.
Right.
And so, the bigger you are, the harder it is to avoid entangling in something else.
Right.
So, naturally, you move forward from there, and our foreign policy continues. We got involved with, chasing Pancho Villa in Mexico. We were involved in a whole bunch of things before World War I.
Right.
And when World War I came around, right away you had people who wanted to join.
Yeah.
On the side of the Allies. Right away you had, again, the same group of people, whether it was the Lusitania or the Zimmerman Note or whatever, that were trying to advocate to get us in, and it crossed party lines. You had somebody like Teddy Roosevelt, who was very much interventionist.
Yes.
Then in the same party, with the same progressive domestic agenda, you had somebody like Bob La Follette, who was the total opposite.
Right.
Who did not want to get involved in that, even though they both identified themselves as progressives. So you had dissension within the dissension. So, yeah, totally changed. And, we've talked about the executive branch before. I'm going to even fast forward it further, and I will go back to this era here. But you go to after World War II. The last time we declared war was 1941.
Right.
You look at NATO, I look at that as a defensive thing.
Right.
But if you actually read the terms of NATO, we ceded power to declare war in a defensive situation. You get something like the UN when North Korea invaded South Korea.
Yep.
Where was the congressional action that authorized 35,000 American lives to be lost?
Right.
I mean, there was, outside of Robert Taft, there was pretty much no discussion of, and I'm not second-guessing President Truman, I'm not doing that.
Right.
I'm just saying, if you look at it, it went on from President Eisenhower in Lebanon to President Kennedy in Vietnam to Nixon in Laos and Cambodia to Clinton in Kosovo and in Somalia and in Rwanda. It continued with President Obama in places like Libya and President Trump in cases of Syria.
Well, you mentioned also with Kennedy, I mean, the whole Bay of Pigs in Cuba and just things like that.
Regime change.
Tell me
that's what it was about.
Should we have ever gotten involved in Chile? No. Look what became of Pinochet being in power and the people that were killed, and it was terrible. But and you talk about that whole history, and Kennedy for the most part tried to keep us out of the whole Vietnam thing, and then Lyndon Johnson is the one that actually got us involved, and then there's the whole discussion around, did he incite Gulf of Tonkin? Did he not incite Gulf of Tonkin? And, did he overreach with his executive power to get us into that war? And, that...
Yes, but we were already there. That's the part that's glossed over.
It is.
I agree with you completely that when Diem was overthrown, that it was, unfortunately, President Kennedy died right after that.
Right.
We'll never know, but I don't know that he would have. I don't think he'd have been as dumb as President Johnson was and mismanaged it as bad. And I don't think he'd have invaded like Nixon and really escalated the war while publicly trying to downplay what he was doing. But the truth is, Gulf of Tonkin was out of 100 steps, that was step 99.
Right.
You know what I mean? It wasn't. That's just, unfortunately, with our expanded reach around the world by that point, it was kind of a small part of a longer. The first American who died in Vietnam was 1961. I mean, people think of the war starting in 65, 66, but it really started way before that. So
it did.
Yeah, and it does start with this, but let me bring it back to the progressive era, because you kind of see a change in Americans' politicians, a change in and you also see a change in where we're living. Americans are living in cities now.
Right.
They're not all farmers, and you're seeing, and it had to be an interesting time to be alive.
Yeah.
Because you had the telephone, you had electricity, cars were not available to everybody yet.
Just on the verge of the Industrial Revolution.
It had to be you had radio wouldn't be in people's houses really to the 20s, but it existed then. You had sports. You had World Series starting. I mean, it had to be kind of like living today with all the technological things that every day you're amazed at what your phone can do. it kind of had to be like that for people like that. Like somebody who grew up on a farm and now they're 70 years old and they look at the world and go, what happened?
Yeah.
And it had to be that way for folks like that. And with the cities came a whole host of problems.
Yeah, well, you go back to Jefferson, and he called them cesspools.
Yes, Jefferson was... you have to love Jefferson.
Oh, yeah.
He was a farmer who hated farming. Yeah. I mean, that was... Monticello, he never plowed anything there.
No.
You know? He didn't like it, but he championed the lifestyle.
Right.
You know, and so... so, you know, that's... cities presented a whole another thing of something that was new to Americans. Had not seen that before. You didn't have people living in the suburbs. You didn't have, you know, it was just a totally new thing.
Yeah, a suburb, what is that? You know, back then they didn't have it.
A suburb was Brooklyn. I don't know. It was a suburb to the Bronx, I guess.
Oh. Yeah, so that whole era, I mean, everything shifted. You're on the verge of the Industrial Revolution. You've got the Spanish-American War where American policy changes and you start to have this overreach of what would be executive power going out and changing the way that it interacted with the legislative branch, with the judicial branch, with American people, with foreign powers. It's all different.
And throughout that era, and in fact, I would say going all the way through the 30s, what you saw was that what came with that was not just foreign policy, but it was domestic policy.
Absolutely.
You saw whether that was the creation of the income tax, whether that was taking away, you know, states' ability to appoint senators, which is where we lost a lot of our states' rights.
Yeah.
Whether that was the Federal Reserve, prohibition. You saw a total transfer of power. You know, people might be surprised to know that before the year 1900, before the year 1905, if you lived your life, you may have had no interaction with your federal government.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you were in the military or dealt with the post office or customs or paid a tariff on something, you may not have known your federal government even existed. What a change would happen over the next few decades. I mean, it took a little break in the 20s.
Yep.
But come the 30s, we would forever be changed into what it has morphed into what we've become. So that, of course, took its toll on local governments as well, and what they did and how they were formed. We'll get into that in a little bit. But you know, when you see shifts like this, I mean, every shift has a winner and a loser. You know, there's that's the thing that makes government so hard to unravel. Is every little thing has its supporters, its beneficiaries, and things like that. And there were good things that happened in this era, you know, women getting the right to vote and things like that, which is something. Primaries happened during this era, which progressives did champion as well, and it was kind of held off by the old guard that kind of controlled who got what positions and what nominations and all that. So there were some things. I think there were some necessary labor changes that had to be made with our changing economy.
Right.
People, you know, shouldn't go to work and get killed. You know, there are things that happened that I think were needed. However, the shift toward a stronger federal government and ultimately a stronger president, like we've talked about, can be traced directly back to here and maybe irreversible.
Yeah, it might be, you know, and Theodore Roosevelt, who came out of the Spanish-American War and really had kind of cut his teeth there.
It helped him become governor of New York. It helped him become vice president, and then by an unfortunate occurrence, the assassination of President McKinley.
Right.
He was in the White House 3.5 years after this war ended.
Right. But you look at what he brought, and there's some of that people can argue, there was good that came along with Theodore Roosevelt. There was also things that I believe were pretty heavy-handed and gave more power to the executive branch, and whether that's taking swaths of land for national parks, whether that is that's kind of where the bully pulpit term comes from, is from Theodore Roosevelt's days, because he used the power of the executive branch to get some things accomplished.
Yeah, but not legislatively.
No, not legislatively. Whether you're talking trust busting or any of that kind of stuff, it's...
Well, and ultimately, I think Roosevelt supporters would come back with, well, Congress passed the Sherman antitrust law, but it took the executive branch to enforce it.
Yeah.
But I would come back with, and I think Roosevelt did do this to a certain extent, competition weeds out good and bad companies.
Right.
Just because a company is dominant in a field, they're dominant there for a reason.
Exactly.
They make the better product, they have the better service, they have the better whatever.
Right.
I think there comes a time where a monopoly needs to be broken up. Mm-hmm. And there comes a time where government has to sit back, okay, wait a minute here. The people have chosen something.
Right.
And I think that's where the blanket, trust busting, as we would call it, and it was slowed down under President Taft a lot.
Yes.
But it was picked back up after he was defeated.
Right.
I think that's... Roosevelt, I don't think abused that as much, but he set the stage for it to be abused.
Right.
He set the precedent for what every other president could look back on and say, well, don't yell at me, I'm just doing what my predecessor did. It's like today, I'll give you an equivalent to today. Some president signs an executive order, so another president also signs it. Well, the previous president could do it, why can't I?
Right.
I got the power now. Elections have consequences. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we get to too much power being in one place, and good intentions. And a good one you mentioned was setting aside land for national parks. Sounds great, right? Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? The federal government now owns 28% of all land in this country.
Yeah. Nevada? It's like 98% of
New
Nevada?
Mexico, it's very high. And there are unintended consequences to that action.
Absolutely.
And Teddy Roosevelt might have been, he was a rancher in the 1880s. And he might have been thinking to himself, I have to protect something here. I have to preserve this area or forest or whatever. But the way he went about it was to sit down in a room and say, well, is there something that stops me from doing this? No? Okay, then I declare it.
Yeah.
Here's a bird sanctuary in Wyoming. Stop me if you can.
Which is ridiculous. Taking that example, that's where Wyoming should have stood up and said, no, I don't think it's the national federal government's responsibility to do that on a state-by-state basis. If a state wants to set aside some of its own
states
land.
were doing that. That's the thing. States were doing that.
I think that's where it runs afoul, if you ask me, is the fact that the federal government did not have those powers set aside to them in the Constitution.
Yeah. And today, a president could walk in, we saw this with President Clinton, walks in to find some endangered species, some fish that's washed up, and can use that as an excuse to block people from fishing, block people from boating, block people from driving, block people from building, and just off limits by the snap of their fingers. And that's what it's grown to.
Yep. It's a huge overreach by the executive branch using the administration to do that. And for that, I mean, we really have to fast forward a little bit from Roosevelt to Wilson, who excelled at creating layers of administration upon layers of administration to manage, not just enforce the laws that Congress passed, but to actually create law and to put policy out there as far as the way that government was run.
Yeah, not to mention grow the size of government in the executive branch. I mean, we added, I can't remember when the Department of Commerce was added. It used to be Commerce and Labor. Then it got separated around that time.
Right.
And things like that grew while people like Wilson were in office. And, and of course, Wilson was there during Prohibition, which I know he was not in his best mental capacity then. It was after his stroke.
Right.
But, I mean, there was a lot of growth. And, of course, when you declare national forests, well, then you have national forest employees. You have you've taken that upon yourself. You've now created another layer of bureaucracy, whether that was your intent or not.
Right.
That's the reality that happened.
Yeah, I mean, originally, we had a State Department, we had a Treasury Department,
a War Department,
and that was it. That's always State and Treasury.
Attorney General. I think we had maybe a Postmaster
we may have done
General.
that. Yeah, we did have a War Department. You're right.
Henry Knox, the first Secretary of War.
Post Office Department. But it was really it. Post Office Department, Department of War, State, Treasury, all the way up to like 1870 when they added Department of Justice. Or 1849 is when they added the Department of the Interior. 1889 then was Agriculture. And it wasn't until the 1900s where we started adding Commerce. In 1903, Labor in 1913. Department of the Army in 47, which is they then got rid of that.
That became
Army
the
and Navy, the Defense Department. Health and Human Services in 53, Housing and Urban Development in 65, Energy in 77, Education in 79. Carter added a lot of this. Veterans Affairs in 89, and Homeland Security in 2003, and it's just ballooned.
Well, everything the federal government gets into, they need to have somebody administering it. I mean, look at what you mentioned about housing and urban development.
Yeah.
What was that tied to? The Great Society.
Yes.
Look what the Department of Energy. It was tied to nuclear energy and 3 Mile Island and all that kind of stuff. Education, which could have happened in the 60s. That's when the federal government really got started in that. But it was more the 70s when they started passing mandates, and I think President Ford had vetoed some of that stuff, and President Carter had come in and gone for that. So the executive branch not only has grown in power, but when they take on a new issue, no, they need their person in charge. They need their enforcement wing. They need their research wing. They need blah, 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 blah. So now now you got 15 cabinet departments.
Absolutely. And, there are things that are tied to these. I mean, it's not just the Department of such and such and it's left alone. I mean, you've got the EPA that fits in there. You've got, all these different departments that fit under the big department, and
then the acts that go below that. Talk about the EPA, you got the Clean Water Act, you got you've got all of these legislation that is aimed at that is being enforced by an agency that is under the Department of. The same thing with labor laws. I mean, you've got labor laws. You go back to Wilson's time, you had the Clayton Act, which was put under the Department of Labor for the Department of Labor to go out and enforce. So you had a new department, then he gave them more power to go off, and Congress played a role in it. I mean, they funded this, and they, so they have to take some of the blame. But what they're not understanding is they handed over their own powers are over now. Now there's no check and balance to it.
Right. So yeah, I mean, what we start to see in Wilson's time is that all this legislation that normally would have occurred in order for things to happen was now being circumvented and coming through administrative purposes through the different departments that had been created. And then, we saw, as bad as Wilson was, we saw FDR pile on top of that as well,
And you talk about somebody who abused, about court packing.
Oh, my word.
How about the NRA? I'm
Right.
not talking about the National Rifle Association.
No.
I'm talking about what Al Smith would call the National Runaround. But the National Recovery Act, and you know what the basis of that was? The basis of that was for government, and it was the beginning of public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
If you look at the TVA,
Yeah.
okay, that was setting up monopolies in energy.
Yes, it was.
And one of the people who owned a company there was Wendell Willkie. And Wendell Willkie had been a lifelong Democrat, and he ran against FDR in 1940 because he said the TVA is illegally. Basically, the TVA put him out of business.
Right.
But if you look at the NRA was designed to have a planned economy.
Yes.
The NRA was designed to. Now today, that's not a shocking thing.
No.
Because business and government get in bed all the time. But that was a very way out there thing at that time, was to have a planned economy. Think how far we went from 1900 to 1933. Think how much this country had shifted.
Yeah.
Whether intentionally or not.
Well, and I think there's still heights that we have not reached.
Yeah,
I mean, you think about putting the Blue Eagle in the window and don't do business if there's not,
Better Business Bureau.
But now it's like, well, we're just going to have single garbage hauling, or it's this or it's that. And these are the companies you do business with because these are approved by the city. We've given them licenses to come in and
trim your
roof
trees.
houses and trim trees. These are the approved businesses.
Even though they're already licensed by the state.
Right. And so that is equivalent, I think, to that Blue Eagle, and it doesn't reach into department stores and stuff like that, although they have found ways to, if they don't like the way you do business, to fine you, to suspend your license, to do things to hamper your ability to do business.
Of course.
And I guess we're kind of foreshadowing a little bit. We're coming around to the local end of this, but when you look at the Civilian Conservation Corps and you look at the NRA and you look at all this stuff, the TVA that was put into place, I mean, it was just such another growth of executive power, and it just gave Lyndon Johnson the ability to do what he did with the Great Society.
Yeah, and I'll tell you something, if you want to look at other things under the New Deal, how about all the public works stuff?
Oh, my word.
Which was not the job of the federal government to go in and build a school somewhere. And that had never happened.
Right.
It was seen as, well, wait a minute. So now that the federal government built the school, now they have to have a say now on what's going on.
Right.
Now the proponents of that would say, well, you're putting people to work, blah, 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 but you're not. You're taking money out of the private sector at a time where the private sector didn't have very much.
Right.
And then you're making the government the largest employer.
Well, and you're giving people temporary jobs that go away.
That's true. They go build park benches for a few weeks and they go back to selling apples.
Yeah.
I tell you what, here's my case against the New Deal. 1940, President Roosevelt's running for a third term. You know we had 18% unemployment?
Yeah.
In 1940. That's after 8 years.
Yeah. Oh, it got worse because there was the whole depression within a depression.
Right, in 37.
Yes.
The Roosevelt recession.
Yes.
I mean, and then you had Social Security taxes collected at that time. You had minimum wage get put in, which I think probably hurt people more than it helped. I mean, nothing like a good war, to stimulate the economy and get us out of it. But we really weren't out of it until 1946. I mean, that was really when we were finally out of that. I don't think the New Deal did anything.
No.
To improve all it did was grow the size of government and create programs that today we're still paying for.
And for some reason, I know my grandparents were probably FDR Democrats, and I still to this day can't figure out for what reason, because I hear about how things were, and I watch them collect salt packets and pepper packets and ketchup packets and straws till the day that they died, because you didn't throw stuff away.
Well, I don't know. I think President Roosevelt did a great job of creating the illusion of success. Now, what I mean by that is he was the first president to use the radio. He was the first president to, they had New Deal clips in movie theaters.
Right.
They would. I think if you were dying of hunger and you got to work for a month,
right.
you took it because that's what you had to do to survive.
Yeah.
I think if you were in the labor movement and you felt like you were being treated unfairly, you maybe saw him as somebody advocating for you. I think President Roosevelt was very, very good. One of the best, and I don't necessarily mean that as a compliment, of creating the myth about himself, if you will.
Well, he created the whole Office of War Information for World War II. The way that they sold that whole thing.
Well, they did in World War I too, the Creel Commission.
Right.
It was their job it was what we talk about the Met Council doing. Mm-hmm. We're going to do this, then we're going to go out and sell.
Right.
We're going to declare war, and then we're going to convince you that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So, and Roosevelt did do that. He bought posters. He bought, I think, repealing prohibition probably got him some fans.
Probably.
He increased farm subsidies. That was something that was slowed down in the 1920s.
Right.
He went after big banks. I think if you got a Social Security check and never paid anything into it, I think there were a lot of you get it. I think you have to understand that it was a desperate time that people were looking for. I think, especially compared to Herbert Hoover, Roosevelt was charismatic, and he was. I've always been a fan of his. How he couldn't walk and he didn't want people to know that.
Yeah.
And he didn't let that stop him from being governor, being president. I've always admired that spirit in him. And I will say this for FDR. World War II, he was the right guy to have in office for the most part.
Yeah.
He was the right guy. He picked Dwight Eisenhower over 360 other senior officers. He did do a few things right there, even though I think he was too ill at the end to stop the spread of communism.
Right.
And I think his incapacitation led to the Iron Curtain, but that's something different. He could be a deceitful, arrogant guy too.
Right.
And the court packing was a great example of that. Mm-hmm. So, that's what happens when you give the executive too much power. They think they can go anywhere they want to.
Right. And so I think that we saw during that time then this huge increase. I mean, it was out there because there was a vacuum. He was just able to step in and fill it. And
that's how a dictator does it, though, right?
That is how a dictator does it.
They burn the rights tag and blame somebody else. I'm not comparing FDR to a Nazi. I'm just saying you have your crisis.
Right.
And that's when people's...
Yep.
You have 9/11, and then 2 days later the Patriot Act's passed at 4:30 in the morning, but nobody's on it.
Right.
That would have never passed in 1995.
No.
So, it takes a crisis for power to shift, whether that crisis was created, whether it was a natural disaster. All of a sudden there's a crisis and boom, there's a little bit of something, and then you give it away and you never give it back. There's a guy from Watergate, G. Gordon Liddy.
Yes.
I was on a plane one time, and I always wrote, when I traveled for a living, I always bought a book to read because I hated flying. And he wrote a book, and I would recommend it. It was a long time ago. He wrote it like 12 years ago. He said, when I was a kid, this was a free country.
Yes.
And I got to tell you, it was one of the best books about how things have changed in his lifetime. Okay, so he's a baby boomer. He grew up I don't know how old he was during Watergate, maybe in the 30s or 40s, but he's probably 75 or 80 now. Right. Maybe he's not that old, I don't know. But, and it was great just in his lifetime how different things have become.
Right.
But it really wasn't a Republican or Democratic book. I don't know how to describe it. It was kind of like, when I was a kid, I wasn't on the back of a milk carton. And when I was a kid, I could, I went to school and, got disciplined. When I was a kid, everybody in the neighborhood lived there for 20 years. It was undescribable how good it was. And I kind of feel like the phrase has always gotten to me. When I was a kid, this is a free country. If you don't know freedom, if you don't have freedom, you can't lose it.
Right.
So, we talked about how big government's gotten. To a lot of people, if you're 25 years old out there, you can't relate to 1981. You know what I mean? Like, you can't, I'm trying to think of an example that would make some sense. But, when I was a kid, there was no internet. We didn't have cable. It was an innocent way to grow up.
It was.
I wasn't, I admit there was the nudie section that my friend's brother worked at Schindler's, and I peeked in there once in a while. That was about the worst thing I did as a kid. All I did was play baseball in the summertime and football in the fall, and I didn't have a care in the world. And I just worry that for whatever circumstances, that's harder and harder and harder, it feels like, to achieve. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Well, I do. And again, going back to that period, looking at, it was, I think, 1928 when Edward Bernays wrote his propaganda book, and then there was the whole, we've got to kill democracy in order to save it. Well, I'm still waiting for it to come back. Once we give that up, we don't get it back. And we've seen this.
Yeah, once you give somebody power, what's the likelihood that we have a bunch of George Washingtons out here?
Yeah.
Not very much.
No.
It's just it's not human nature to give it back.
No, it's not. And I think that we end up justifying it as well. And over time, it's like we just get used to not being free.
Yeah, we get used to looking at our paycheck and thinking of our before tax money and our after tax money. That's not money we earned.
Right.
It's like, you want to get people angry about taxes? I've always said this because I'm part of the 53% that actually pays federal taxes. Have them cut a check to the government every month. No, I'm not going to take anything out of your paycheck. No, at the end of the month, you're going to cut me a check.
Yeah.
Not withholding anything.
Yeah.
You're going to cut me, and you don't get everything back. Social Security and Medicare, that gets gobbled up.
Yeah.
You don't get to write that off on your mortgage. Okay? And it's not like the mortgage is cheap either.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but what government has done is they've told us, and this gets back to my point about Mr. Liddy.
Yeah.
You and I, okay, my mom and dad, your mom and dad, they don't know what it's like to live without an income tax.
Right.
Nobody alive today was working in 1886 when you got your entire paycheck. That paycheck might not have been that big, but you were the destiny of that paycheck.
Yeah.
There wasn't something taken out, put in a rainy day fund. The state didn't have their hand. We didn't have a tax in Minnesota until 1933.
Yeah.
We don't know what that's like.
Right.
You and I don't know that feeling.
No.
Okay. I don't know what it's like to have the old one schoolhouse in the place where it's run by the locals. Nobody needed a license. Nobody had to be unionized. You didn't need Magruder's textbook from Washington, D.C. There was no anti-bullying rule.
Yeah.
We don't know what that's like either. To us, the way government does it is normal. Mm-hmm. And that's why I've always been an admirer of Eastern Europe. These people who just got their freedom within our lifetime.
Right.
I remember when the Berlin Wall fell.
Me too.
Yeah, and when the Soviet Union fell, it wasn't that long ago in time of history. But I always say this: the former Soviet Union has lower tax rates than we do. What does that tell you
exactly
about where we've morphed? I mean, it's you look at Eastern Europe. They make nothing, produce nothing, do nothing. Why is that what we want to be like? And again, there's things to admire about their cultures and things like that too. But I mean, we're on their path, I guess is what I'm saying. And if you look at the things, and I'm going to go off the reservation again here, but if you look at things that led to the European Union, and I know we've had the Brexit, or however you pronounce it, the leaving of England
Brexit,
Brexit. If you look at the things, they had chronic unemployment. Yeah. They had a lack of manufacturing jobs and a lack of blue-collar industry. And all of these factors, and this is back in the 70s and 80s for Western Europe. They're all things that we have now. Uh-huh. I mean, we consider full employment in this country 5% unemployed. Yeah. Now, remember, that's people seeking work.
Right.
Okay. So
not people not seeking work.
That's not considered that.
Right.
We haven't had that since the 90s in this country. Mm-hmm. So it is BS that everybody's acting like happy days are here again, and they're better than they were. Mm-hmm. But we've overreached to the point where the private sector can't pick it all up anymore, I don't think.
Right. And I think that there are national, federal reasons why. I think there are statewide reasons why.
Definitely.
But there are also local reasons why. And because there has been an overreach of government at the local level, and it has a lot to do with this executive overreach. The executive branch of local government is so much more powerful than the legislative branch, and a lot of you are going to say, because the majority of cities out there are led by a city manager, and the city council is all just the legislative branch, and some of you understand it, some of you don't. The executive branch is all administration. City employees that have a regular job that don't ever go away unless they move to another city to do the same job.
Right, but you know what? It goes back to the progressive era.
It does.
That we talked about. That's where these ideas were put into place.
Absolutely.
Let me ask. I'll put you on the spot.
Okay.
Well, because I know you know the answer. Why did that happen? I mean, why is my mayor? I read a book about President Cleveland.
Okay.
A long time. I don't remember the title. And he was the mayor of Buffalo, New York, before he was governor and before he was president.
Right.
And he was a sheriff out there too in the 1870s, and that was kind of as strange as it sounds, a little bit of a Wild West area. I mean, because it's upstate. It has nothing to do with New York City. It was just a weird kind of. I mean, I don't want to compare it to Dodge City or something, but it was kind of it was a little bit of a lawless territory and a little bit of a rough place. And President Cleveland made a name for himself vetoing city council legislation. It's one of the things that got him noticed to run for governor, was that the reformers, the people who, even though Cleveland wasn't quite with them on a lot of issues, but they saw him as an honest, decent champion that they could back even if they didn't always agree with him. But he held the power over the city council. City council was passing, laws that would benefit their friends. Some of them were, put there by this Roscoe Conkling type.
Yeah.
And Cleveland would stay up all night, read everything. He would reread it. Mm-hmm. He would do additional research. He would talk it. He would spend all the time he had to veto it before he would. But we don't have that now in mayors. Now, if Grover Cleveland were the mayor of Buffalo today,
right,
he would just be another vote out of 7 or 8 or 12,
which is probably true. I mean, we have some cities, and maybe Buffalo is a bad example. Hard to say. I haven't looked at that one, but your bigger cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth. We're talking Minnesota here. Yeah. They have a strong mayor who is able to form the head of the executive branch. Most cities do not, though, and you're right. They're just another vote on they're a figurehead. They're a figurehead of the legislative branch. And so you've got these employees. Well, and it was done just what you said, though. I mean, it was part of the progressive movement. It rose out of that. They were trying to get rid of the political machine that was giving out favors to friends, and there were abuses to that system. But like you said, like Cleveland stood in there and he read everything and he said, no, this isn't going to happen. Veto. Like I think you had mentioned before off air, it had this whole Tammany Hall type effect where there were favors and things that were illegal happening under the table, and favor this business, favor that business. I don't think it's any different today, though. It's just that there's a different Tammany Hall.
Right. The Tammany Hall today is the little club of city managers. Mm-hmm. The Tammany Hall today is the American Planning Association.
And it's worse because they're not elected.
Yeah. The Tammany Hall is, Park Board. That's the Tammany Hall. They control who's... I mean, you have cities like Crystal that says it in their charter that they cannot interfere or appoint anyone other than the city manager.
Right.
So if the city hall... If our elected people don't want so-and-so as the police chief, they can do absolutely nothing. In fact, they can't even influence it.
Right.
Only thing they can do is make policy that the city manager has to carry out and get rid of that person if they don't. But that's not that easy either.
No.
They're under contract. They all have, their little club has legal representation. Mm-hmm. So I agree. I think we've made it way worse. Mm-hmm. Because to me, I can always get rid of an elected official I don't like. It's not always easy. I don't always replace that person with somebody who's perfect. Mm-hmm. But there is at least we have some control over that.
Right.
It's not a lifetime appointment. The way so many, and you see it at the state level. What do you see it? We see the head of MnDOT coming out saying, "Hey, we're done building roads.
Yeah,
no, we're not going to build anymore." Well, who the hell are you to say that?
Right.
I didn't elect you to be in charge of roads. Well, your job's to shut up and go do your job.
And going back to what you talked about, I mean, if you talk about the outflow of a city council saying to a city manager, hey, here's what we want you to go do, that's one thing, but most city councils have abdicated their authority. Yeah. And it's not this, here's the policy, you go do it. It's, hey, tell us what policy you want us to discuss, and then we'll talk about it, we'll vote on it, and then you can go do it.
Very much. It's very much, nobody seems to be smart enough to sniff out an agenda. Mm-hmm. I mean, nobody seems to want to. I think that's part of the problem we have. Is so many city councils are part-time people who never thought they'd end up here, or got elected and didn't think they'd win. I don't know. I mean, or they got elected because of one or two issues in their neighborhood, and suddenly they're thrown into comprehensive plans, and they're thrown into city charters, and they're thrown into budgets, and they're thrown into CAFRs, and without the proper training and understanding. And if they've gotten training, it's been from the very people that are feeding them this stuff.
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean, we've replaced this. And when you talk about executive power, I mean, executive is almost everything at the city level.
Yes.
And I'm not just talking that. You could bring this to your school districts.
Uh-huh.
The only people that the school districts employ in Minnesota is the superintendent.
Yes.
They don't hire teachers.
Nope.
They don't hire principals. They don't. In some cases, they don't even make policy.
Right.
That's in your schools. That's kind of. I don't want to get into it too far, but that's kind of a half truth. And then on top of it, you've got the Department of Education. Yeah. In St. Paul, the Department of Education in Washington.
Yeah.
And you've got a teachers union, and you've got every other union from AFSCME to SEIU to the bus drivers having their own union and so on and so forth. I mean, they're in very little control over what's going on. I'm not making excuses for them. I'm just saying it is what it is. I mean, they have to take their authority back, but they also have limits to their authority. And the same thing that we talked about in Crystal. We need a charter change.
Right.
The charter has to change for this to be reversed. Ultimately, we have to make a charter change.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you could go into any city charter and probably, erase Crystal and put Golden Valley, and you probably have the same damn thing.
Right. And so what is the best solution? Do we go and do we need somebody elected as the head of the executive branch, or do we need to put the executive branch in their place and say, we make the laws as the legislative branch, it is your job to carry them out. We do not want your policy, we do not want your ideas, we want you to go do what we have voted on.
Yes and yes is the answer. But you do see this, I'll explain in a minute. You do see this, though, in Washington, too.
Right.
You see the president making the initiative. Forget who the president is.
Right.
President Reagan did it, President Bush did it, President Obama did it, President Trump certainly is doing it. I want this.
Yep.
You go pass it.
Yep.
He sits down with McConnell and Ryan or whoever and says, this is what I want.
Yeah.
This is what I'll sign.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same kind of thing. I mean, not completely, because they can work together and there's a veto override. And but like under President Obama, he didn't get what he wanted. He enforced it anyway.
Right.
But let me bring it back to what do we do locally? I mean, let me answer that a little more. Yes and yes is the answer. In the short run, councils need to take all the authority they can have. And it's just the authority to try to level the playing field with the executive branch somehow.
Yeah.
In the long run, ultimately, the solution is a mayor who acts like a governor or like the president.
Right.
Not making their own law. Okay?
Yeah.
I don't want executive orders from City Hall.
No.
But ultimately, you need the checks and balances. We are a republic, not a democracy, and that's something that you've said a lot, that I've said a lot.
Yeah.
Democracy is 50.01% rule. That's not what we are.
No, it's two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. It's why we have an electoral college. It's it's all of that. It's because the majority of what people think, you can't govern by poll numbers. You can't pee in the wind and figure out how you're going to do something. If that's what you are, you don't belong. You're not a leader. You don't belong there. You got to have a set of principles. And when you look at what would happen if the mayor acted like a governor, think about, we talked about in the previous show about taking the age of tobacco from 18 to 21.
Yeah.
What if you had a mayor that could veto that?
Yeah.
What if you had to override that veto?
Right.
How much harder would it be today? All that has to happen is you go and have 2 readings, and you can pass anything you want to.
Yeah.
But look at how much harder it is to do it, say, at a state level. You start in the House, you start in a committee, and you it's designed that way, and it should be that way. It should be hard to pass something, not easy. But look how easy it is. Look at Hennepin County passing that transit tax. They did it like they were, like they were late to a manicure. But just imagine if you had that check and balance.
Yeah.
If you had, instead of a 4-3, instead of mob rule, you had to have a supermajority to pass something.
Right.
How much of a dynamic would that change local elections? I mean, think about it for a second. Think about all the crap we fought in Crystal.
Yeah.
Think of all the crap that we've tried to push since. Think about how long it took, just to get this or this or this. And think about how easily they were able to just say no, or something like that, And it's just, I think, in the short run, you get the legislative authority that you should have. In the long run, we need an elected executive branch,
right?
Not somebody who's part of a club, not somebody who's got the League of Minnesota Cities on speed dial. We need that independent. Person there to do that.
Yes, we do.
So
I'm with you, and I think both of those things are important, and I believe with my whole heart that is the way forward, that we have got to stop the inflow of information and ideas from the unelected cabal, if you will, of it's almost like city administration gets these ideas from their social clubs and networks and League of Minnesota Cities and it happens in every state. It's not just Minnesota. But they go forward and they bring these ideas. They get talked about at work sessions, and it's just backwards. I mean, it needs to start with the city council and then come to the executive branch once something has actually passed.
So now let's take our last few minutes here.
Okay.
So how do we change that? How do we go about changing people's minds? Because one of the things I didn't know when I got into local politics, I didn't know that the city manager ran the city.
Right, me neither.
And I have to guess that your average person doesn't know that either.
No.
They think you're the mayor. Oh, you're the police chief's boss. No, you aren't.
No.
At all. In fact, if anything, you are prevented from being their boss.
That's correct.
So to me, the first step is we got to explain to people how your school district, your county government, and your city work. In order to get up the... I always say this. Imagine if we had an at-large legislator, or if the governor were a member of... We'd never accept that.
Right.
As people. That would be a violation of every principle that we hold dear. So tell me, isn't this the same thing? Isn't this a violation of every single thing that our founding documents were based on?
Yes. And Thomas Jefferson used to talk about each city should have its own warden who is in charge of the city, and in a mirror type fashion of what a governor. He
wasn't talking about a city manager,
right? No, he was not. He's talking about an elected official, and that was the original design and how it worked up until the early 20th century, late 19th century, and so. I think what we need to do first is find people that are willing to run and step into these positions. The second thing that we need to do is we need to take a look at, if you're in the majority of cities in Minnesota, you give away all your freedom to the state because you're a statutory city. You need to become a charter city, and because that allows you to make your own rules, and you can create a setup for your government, because as a statutory city, you are beholden to have a manager as the head of your city, whether it's as a council manager system, whether it's as a weak mayor council system. The city manager or administrator runs your city, and that's the majority of cities in this state. So you need a charter.
Over 2/3 of them.
You need a charter, because once you have a charter, you can make your own rules. You can become a strong mayor city. You can put your own thing that works for your city.
It's your own city constitution.
Yeah.
Look at it like that.
If the mayor doesn't want to become the head of the executive branch in that way, where it's a full-time job, maybe you figure out a relationship that works with the city manager, where they're still responsible to the mayor in some form or fashion.
Or they do some of the day-to-day stuff, but they're not they're not the ones making.
But they don't submit legislation, or they don't, from that side. These are things that can be written into a city charter, and so that's why it is so important to move in this direction.
Well,
wow.
We only got 120 years up against us here.
Oh, that's it. That's it. We're only behind by 120 years.
I wonder what the first city to implement a city manager was.
I can actually tell you that.
Are you serious?
Sumter, South Carolina.
You're kidding.
No.
Boy, that's one of the last places.
Although it was credited as Staunton, Virginia.
Well, next time I'm driving through Sumter, South Carolina, I'm going to remember that they started this.
Yes, I would not be very happy about it.
No, we should have a billboard.
I might shake my fist at them as I pass by City Hall.
Brutal.
Yeah, it's not good. I'll tell you that. And I'm hoping that people will start to take notice and turn the tide back. That's what we got to do.
Well, and we got it. And I'll tell you what, though. Let me throw something out at you. It does take this to be a charter city. That's very important. It's also important to have legislators that will reform some of this too, because you can hit it on two different ends. If you want to be a statutory city, that you can still be statutory. They don't have to tell you what kind of government to set up.
Yeah.
I mean, what I mean by that is, if you don't want to write your own charter, you still should be able to get out from under, not having a city manager.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's not the case.
That's not the way the law is written. So, yeah, we could use some help from St. Paul, too. I know we won't get it, but we certainly could. They're too busy, trying to ban you from using your cell phone or something like that, or raising the smoking age or something to bother with, this stuff. So, and I'm sure we have a governor who's disinterested as well. But, ultimately, first and foremost, cities need to act on their own.
Absolutely.
And not wait for something to happen.
Absolutely. And I think that Mark Corin up in Oak Grove is a great example of what can happen from a manager mayor type relationship, where for a while he just did the job, and we're going to have him on and have him talk about that soon.
It's a great story because he was called some interesting names during that time.
Yeah.
But if you look at Oak Grove, it's the lowest taxed city in Anoka County.
Yeah.
They fought the Met Council. They've elected a council around Mark that has helped him in this. It's a good story. He's got a lot to say.
Yeah, so we're going to do that podcast
maybe
soon.
when I get back from my honeymoon.
That sounds good. But we want to talk to you guys. So, if there's anything that you have questions about from this, it was a fun podcast, I think, and we learned a lot. And I think that there's some ideas to go forward with from this. If you're interested in trying to implement some of this, if you're noticing things in the way that your city is set up that just don't make sense, and why are these people making the decisions they're making, I think we can help you answer those questions.
Yeah, if the the executives are leading the horses to water, you got a problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely you do. So give us an email at commsolutionsmn@gmail.com. And we will get back to you, and check out our blog, COMMsolutionsMN.com. So we're going to take a couple week break from recording, but you're going to get this in the off week anyways, because we care that much about you. Andrew,
we care so much that 18 hours before my wedding, we're doing a podcast.
That's true. So I'm going to tell you guys this. We really appreciate you. We know, Minnesota, that you can get up and you can fight and you can win. And so that's why we do this, because we know that it's going to start clicking and you guys are going to mobilize and it's going to be amazing. So get a hold of us. Pass along our podcasts, our blog to other people, because it's only by spreading the word that we win. Andrew, in advance, congratulations. I'm excited to be standing up next to you tomorrow. Never in the history of weddings will there be two guys looking so amazing in standing in front of.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to shave and everything.
Wow. I guess I should too. No? Okay. I probably will, out of respect for your wife.
Okay, so. Well, that's you don't have to for me, though.
All right, that's enough. You don't need to hear about all that. You're bored already. You guys have a great week, and we will talk to you 1 week from today. You can bet on that. So long.